Hi, and welcome to my presentation on canning tomato products. My name is Diane Witten. I'm a food and nutrition educator with Cornell Cooperative Extension of Saratoga County, New York. I am a certified master food preserver, and I've also been teaching home food preservation for just about 20 years now. What I'm hoping you'll learn during this presentation is recipes for boiling water and pressure canning, factors that affect the quality and safety of your canned tomatoes, two types of packing methods and resources. And then for this presentation, I am assuming that you know how to can. If you need to learn that, you can go to the National Center for Home Food Preservation, where they do have some videos, or directions will come with your canner, whether it's a boiling water canner or a pressure canner or even a steam canner. So let's start with the resources. At Cornell Cooperative Extension, we'd like you to use the USDA's National Center for Home Food Preservation as your primary resource. And you can get there through two different websites, but the homefoodpreservation.net is the easiest to remember. If you do homefoodpreservation.com, you'll get there also. But it is housed at the University of Georgia, so that's why you see the web address that is at uga.edu. This is the home page to the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And if on the left-hand side, if you go to the multimedia section, that's where you will see videos, where you can look for videos on how to use a boiling water canner or a pressure canner. But what I want to draw your attention to today is down the section on the left that says, how do I can? If we click on that, we would come to this page. And here we have just some general information where you can learn how to read up about using boiling water or pressure canners. And then today we're focusing on canning tomatoes and tomato products. If you click on that, then you would get the page that shows all the different ways that they have and recipes for canning tomatoes, just plain, crushed or whole or halved tomatoes, or even some sauce or even ketchup or hot sauces. The other resource I want to draw your attention to is my website, which is ccesaratoga.org. If you look under nutrition and food and then food preservation, you'll come to this page. And on the left-hand side is a lot of videos. The presentation I'm doing today will be archived on that site, as well as other presentations that I've done. I do have a link to the National Center for Home Food Preservation at my page. And then on the right-hand side are a lot of different fact sheets on all different topics of food preservation. So I'm going to start with some of the important musts for canning. And the first one is to always use and follow directions from a reputable source. There are a lot of directions out on the internet these days that, and videos, one that I saw recently that was really not, was really quite unsafe, the video that I saw recently, but so we want you to use something that's research-based, tested recipes that you know are going to be safe. So the primary resource for that could be the National Center for Home Food Preservation, which I just showed you. And on that website, there is, from the University of Georgia, you can find So Easy to Preserve, which is a book that contains all of the recipes and procedures that are on the website are in that book. I'm the type of person that likes to have a book in front of me, so I do have this book, and I consider it kind of my canning Bible. If somebody calls me and asks me a question I don't know, I can usually find the answer to it in that book. And then any cooperative extension site, such as my own, or there's cooperative extension offices in every state in the country. So if you look for the cooperative extension in your state, you could find information on, you might find some recipes on canning. But if you search and you get to a .edu website, you can be pretty sure that that's going to be a safe recipe. Also, the Ball Blue Book, the company that makes the Ball canning jars, they've done a lot of research on their recipes, and their Blue Book's been around for decades. But just make sure you're using up-to-date methods and information, and beware of what you learned from your grandmother or somebody else's grandmother, because we've learned a lot of research has been done over the decades, and there are different recommendations for canning today than there were many years ago. If you have a product like a tomato sauce that is a family recipe and it hasn't been tested, you can always freeze that product instead of can it. So when you're canning anything, and tomatoes, you always want to start with the best. So make sure you have good quality, disease-free tomatoes, preferably vine ripened. Do not use tomatoes for canning from dead or frost-killed vines. That changes the pH of the tomato and can make it unsafe for canning. Green tomatoes, actually, which are underripe tomatoes, green tomatoes are more acidic than the ripened fruit, so they can be canned safely, but they will still require acidification according to the recipe directions. And your recipes can be made with all varieties of tomatoes, including tomatillas. The first thing you're going to want to do is decide on the product that you want to make. Do you want to do a crushed tomato, which is good for soups, stews, and casseroles and gives you a really high quality product and is actually the shortest processing time? Or do you want to do whole or halved tomatoes? If you want to do that, there are directions for packing them in water, which has the shortest processing time, packed in tomato juice, or packed raw without any liquid. And those two require longer processing times. And we're gonna look more at those recipes in a minute. Or you might want to decide on a different recipe that you want to do, one maybe from the National Center for Home Food Preservation, including a spaghetti sauce with or without meat. Maybe you want to make a ketchup or an easy hot sauce. You're also going to want to decide on the type of pack that you want to do. A lot of recipes give you two options to do a hot pack or a raw pack. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between those. The picture on the right shows the difference. You can see visually the one on the left is the hot pack tomatoes. The one on the right is the raw pack tomatoes. The advantages of the hot pack is that it's easier to pack them in the jars because with hot pack, you're taking your tomatoes and you're heating them first on your stove. So we know when we heat things, cook things, they get a little softer and they also shrink in quantity. So because of that, you can get more of your tomatoes in a jar if they're hot packed. And then you get less floating. The picture on the right shows what we consider to be floating fruit. So the tomatoes have separated, there's some liquid on the bottom and the tomatoes are floating on the top. And on the right, we don't see any of that. Because when you cook the tomatoes, not only are they shrinking down, one of the reasons it's shrinking down is because the cells are breaking and some of the air that is in the cells is being released. And when you do the raw pack, the air is still in those tomatoes, so they float to the top. The advantage to the raw pack is that it is faster because you're skipping that step of cooking the tomatoes first, but they don't really cook for that long, but we'll look at a recipe in a minute. And the tomatoes, the finished product that you serve is going to be a little firmer in texture. The disadvantage is that floating that you get and the separation. And it's also a longer processing time. And we'll look at that too in the coming slides. Tomato juice is that separation that we saw in the tomatoes in the jar, that can happen in tomato juice too. And it's particularly undesirable in a tomato juice to see the separation. And that is caused by the pectinase, which is an enzyme in the tomatoes, breaks down, allowing the cells to separate. So to prevent that, you want to take a quarter of the tomatoes you're making your juice with, cut them and heat them quickly to a boil. And then after they're boiling, then you can cut the rest of your tomatoes. And as you're cutting, you're going to add them to the boiling tomatoes. So the faster you heat your tomatoes, the less separation you're going to get, whether it is in tomato juice or in your canned tomatoes. If you're making tomato juice, the least desirable method to use is to blend your tomatoes or juice them raw and then heat them. You're going to want to, like I said, the sooner you heat your tomatoes, the less of that separation you're going to get. When you're preparing your tomatoes for canning, all of your directions will tell you to skin the tomatoes. So wash them first. And if you put a little X at the blossom end of the tomato, that will make it easier for the skins to start to peel. And so what I do is I have a pot of boiling water on the stove. I You don't want to throw all your tomatoes in there. Of course, you might have pounds and pounds of tomatoes. You couldn't do that anyway. So, but put in about 3 to 5 tomatoes, depending on the size of the tomatoes. You want to try to keep the water boiling. So don't put too much in so that the water stops boiling. And then after about 30 to 60 seconds, you'll start to see the skin start to split away. Sometimes it takes longer, depending maybe on the ripeness of the tomato. So what I do is I look individually, and as the skins are pulling away, I'll take a slotted spoon and remove it and put it into a bowl of cold water that I have nearby. And you just want them to cool to the point where you can handle them so that you can slip the skins off and core them. Now I want to get into a little bit of science here about foods, and that we're going to talk about the pH of some common foods, because this is an important factor in safety when it comes to canning tomatoes. For canning purposes, foods are divided into low acid foods and high acid foods, and the dividing line between them is a pH of 4.6. So low acid foods are vegetables and meats, so corn, chicken, beets, potatoes, all vegetables and all meat are considered low acid foods. And because of that, they have to be pressure canned in order to prevent the growth of the botulism, the Clostridium botulinum bacteria that can cause botulism food poisoning. High acid foods are all of your fruits, including acidified foods like sauerkraut, which is made from a low acid vegetable that's been acidified through the natural fermentation process. Tomatoes, you can see, are right on the borderline. And some tomatoes are have a pH of 4.8, so it's above that 4.6 pH, which is our cutoff point for being able to either use a boiling water canner, which we can do with all high acid foods, or use a pressure canner. So I talk about that just so I can, so that you will understand why we need to acidify tomatoes. Because they're on the borderline, your directions will tell you to add either a lemon juice, citric acid, or vinegar in order to acidify it so that it will be safe enough to process in a boiling water canner. Now, directions for pressure canning, if you look at the directions for pressure canning, they're also going to say to add acid for pressure canning. And that's because the amount of time getting rid of all of the bacteria in when we're processing is a product of the acidity and the time. Other vegetables and meats that are pressure canned don't have any added acid, so the processing time is going to be longer than with the tomatoes. So don't think that just because you're pressure canning, you don't need to add the acid. If it's in the directions, then you're going to want to add either the lemon juice, the citric acid, or the vinegar. When you're adding lemon juice, you're going to want to use bottled lemon juice because that does have a known acidity as opposed to fresh lemons. And the directions are 1 tablespoon per pint or 2 tablespoons per quart. If you want to use citric acid, which is a white powder, that is going to add less flavor to your product, and you just need a 1/4 teaspoon per pint or 1/2 teaspoon per quart. The other option is to add vinegar, and you want to make sure the vinegar you're using is a 5% acidity. Every bottle of vinegar will tell you right on the label how the acidity level, whether it's 3%, 4%, 5%, 6%. So if it's 5% or more, you're good. And for that, you would add 2 tablespoons per pint and 4 tablespoons per quart. But just note that that might, that's going to affect the flavor. So in terms of the flavor profile, keep that in mind and when you're deciding whether or not you're going to use lemon juice, citric acid, or vinegar. If you do use the vinegar and your product is a little too tart, when you go to, you think it's going to be too tart, you can put some sugar in when you can. So put the lemon juice or vinegar in your jar, then add 1 teaspoon per pint or 2 teaspoons per quart of sugar into each jar, and then proceed with filling your jars. Other ingredients that might be called for are salt, which can be reduced to your taste or eliminated entirely if you wish. It is not a food safety factor. If you are going to use salt, we do recommend using canning and pickling salt, which has no iodine in it and it has no anti-caking agents in it. So it gives you a better quality. If you're in a pinch and all you have is regular salt, you can use it, but just know that it might cause a little cloudiness in your product and might affect the color because of the iodine that's in there. If there are herbs and spices in your recipe, you can exchange them for each other. You don't want to increase the amount. You could decrease the amount, but don't increase the amount because that could affect the acidity. But if there is an herb you don't like and you want to exchange it with another one, you can do that. Just do not add any vegetables that are not in the recipe. Again, if we add more vegetables or a different type of vegetable, that could change the acidity of the final product, which could be a food safety hazard. When it comes to processing tomatoes, you will get directions. Most of the recipes have directions for boiling water canning, which can be substituted with steam canning, or pressure canning. So if you have either of those, you could use either. But if you only have a boiling water canner, check the instructions for the recipe that you're going to make sure that it has directions for boiling water canning, because not everything can be done in a boiling water canner. And then if you live above 1,000 feet, you're going to want to adjust your processing time or pressure depending on the altitude you live at. So, and I'll show you some of the directions, and we'll look at how they give you different amounts of either time or pressure depending on your altitude. If you're using a boiling water canner, it's going to be increased time. If you're using a pressure canner, it's going to be increased pressure. Speaking of pressure canners, there are two different types of pressure canners in the picture I have here. The one on the right is the weighted gauge canner, and the one on the left is a dial gauge canner. If you have a dial gauge canner, you should have that tested annually, or if it's been dropped or bumped, have it tested to make sure it's still accurate. And that is a recommendation by the National Center for Farm Food Preservation. At my office at Cooperative Extension in Saratoga County, I do offer testing. A lot of other Cooperative Extension offices offer that also. Or if you can't get it done at one of your Cooperative Extension offices, call the manufacturer and see if you can send it back to them to have it tested. When we test them, if the gauge is off by 2 pounds or less, you can still use that and just make those adjustments accordingly. If the gauge is off by more than 2 pounds, you should get a new gauge. So here's what your recipe is going to look like. This one is for crushed tomatoes hot pack. It tells you approximately how much you're going to need for a canner load of either 7 quarts or 9 pints. Now, if you don't have that much tomatoes, you don't have 22 pounds of tomatoes, and you just want to do 4 quarts instead, you can certainly do that. Just follow the same procedures. So again, you're going to skin your tomatoes and trim off any bruised or discolored portions. And then just like with the directions I told you with making the tomato juice, you want to heat 1/6 of the quarters quickly in a large pot. Start crushing them with a wooden spoon or a mallet. And as you add them to the pot, and then they'll exude their juice, and gonna heat that until they start to boil. Once they've started boiling, then you can start to cut and add the rest of your tomatoes. Like I said earlier, the sooner you get their tomatoes heated, the less separation you're gonna see. Then you're gonna, after you've got all your tomatoes in, you're gonna boil them for 5 minutes. And again, during that time, that 5 minutes that you're boiling it, a lot of the air, the tomatoes are breaking down, a lot of the air that's in the tomatoes are coming out, and that's gonna cause less floating. And then after your tomatoes are ready, you have your jars. It is recommended to add your lemon juice, citric acid, or the vinegar, whatever is in your recipe, to the jar first, and then add your hot tomatoes to the jar, and salt if you want to use it. Then you're going to leave a 1/2 inch headspace. The headspace is the space between the top of the product and the top of the jar. adjust for altitude if you need to. So these are the different processing times for crushed tomatoes. This one is table 1 is if you have a boiling water canner. Table 2 is what you would use if you have a pressure canner. In the boiling water canner, your processing time for pints is 35 minutes, for quarts is 45 minutes. Now, if you live over 1,000 feet, the time increases to 40 minutes for pints and 50 minutes for quarts. In the pressure canner, the processing time is, the processing time for pints or quarts is 20 minutes, 15 minutes, or 10 minutes, depending on the pressure that you're using. If you've got 5 pounds of pressure, it's 20 minutes, 10 pounds of pressure, it's 15 minutes, 15 pounds of pressure, it's 10 minutes processing. And then if you're over 1,000 feet, the processing time remains the same, but the amount of pressure you're adding increases. Here are the directions for whole or halved tomatoes. These are packed raw. This is the raw packed tomatoes without any added liquid. This is one of the 3 ways that you can do whole or halved tomatoes. You've got the raw pack without added liquid, and then you've got the hot pack with water or tomato juice. Again, you can adjust the amounts that you use. Wash, the same procedures here as for the other, except instead of crushing them, for this recipe, you're going to take your skinned tomatoes, uncooked, raw, and put them in your jar and press the tomatoes into the jar until the spaces between them fill with juice. So you are going to try to get them as much in the jar as you can by pressing them in there. And then leave your head space, adjust your lids, and then process according to the directions. Which here are the directions for processing whole or halved tomatoes. This is for the water-packed whole tomatoes. So these are tomatoes that you're going to add, and then you're going to, instead of just adding the juice, you're going to add water to them. And table 1 below is the recommended processing time for whole or halved tomatoes packed raw without added liquid. And you'll see the processing time for the water packed is 40 minutes for pints, 45 minutes for quarts. But for the raw pack, it's 85 minutes. Big difference in amount of time. And both of these are for boiling water canning. Now there are directions for pressure canning for your raw pack without liquid. And you'll see that the processing time here is just 40 minutes for pints and 40 minutes for pints or quarts at 6 pounds of pressure, 25 minutes at 11 pounds of pressure. So that is a big difference in the processing time. Here's a recipe for the spaghetti sauce without meat. Your ingredients there include not just tomatoes, but here's where we're adding some of our low acid vegetables, the onions, garlic, celery, or green pepper, mushrooms, and then our salt and spices. So you just follow the directions for making this. What's going to be different in the tomato sauce is that after you cook your tomatoes, it tells you to put them through a food mill or sieve in order to make it more like a sauce and not just not a chunky sauce, but actually more of a puree sauce. And then saute your onions and your vegetables until they're tender, and then combine the sauteed vegetables with the tomatoes, adding your spices, salt, and sugar, and then bring it to a boil. You're gonna simmer that uncovered until thick enough for serving. So they're not telling you how long to cook it for. It depends on how much water is in the tomatoes to start with and how thick you want your sauce. That will determine how long you're cooking it for. So you're gonna simmer it uncovered until thick enough for serving. And then at that point, the volume will reduce significantly by about half the amount. Then you're going to fill your jars, leaving 1-inch head space. Instead of the 1/2 inch head space, you're leaving 1 inch head space. And then you adjust your lids and process according to the tables. So here are the tables for canning spaghetti sauce without meat. And because it has so much vegetable in it, notice that there are no directions for doing this recipe in a boiling water canner. There's only directions for doing pressure canning. So this is pressure canning with a weighted gauge, and this is pressure canning with a dial gauge. Table 1 is dial gauge, table 2 is weighted gauge. So you would just follow the directions, 20 minutes for pints and 25 minutes for quarts. And adjust for your altitude if you're over 1,000 feet. 1,000 feet for the weighted gauge, over 2,000 feet for the dial gauge. After you've processed your tomato product, you're going to want to remove them and put them on a kitchen towel or a cutting board. Just don't put them directly on a cool surface like a quartz or granite countertop because the jars might break. You don't want to cool them too rapidly, just let them cool naturally, but don't cover them either. After, you're going to let them sit for about 12 to 24 hours. So after that time, you're going to test the seal, make sure the lid is indented. And if you take the ring bands off and try to lift the lid, you'll know whether or not it's been sealed. So at that point, you're going to clean your jars and then label and date the product. And then store them in a cool, dark place without the ring bands. A lot of people think that they have to store them with the ring bands, but at this point, the ring band is not doing anything. It's not holding the lid on. The lid is vacuum sealed, so it's on there tightly. And if you leave the rings on, the problem, especially here in the Northeast in New York State, where we have a lot of humidity, the rings will likely rust. So wash and thoroughly dry your rings and put them in a plastic bag, and they'll last forever. And then all you have to do is buy new lids for the next time you do your canning, instead of buying lids and rings. Before eating your product, just examine the jars for any signs of leaking. If there's a bulging lid or it looks like anything's been leaking out of it, that could be a sign that there's something growing in there and it wasn't processed properly. And if that's the case, don't taste that food. You can just discard that food. But home canned foods, as long as your lid isn't, or as long as your seal is intact, home canned foods will remain safe indefinitely. But for best quality, we always recommend that you consume your home canned foods within a year. So I hope you will enjoy your home canned tomato products. Thank you very much for attending my presentation. Again, my name is Diane Witten. I work with Cornell Cooperative Extension. My email address, dwitten@cornell.edu. And you can go to our website, ccesaratoga.org, where you can find more videos like this one and fact sheets on food preservation.